Hello and welcome. Today we have a new story for you. It is called The Longest Tide, written by Eleanor Marsh. Find yourself a comfortable place and let us begin together. Act 1. The Postcard. The postcard arrived on a Thursday in early autumn, and Ruth almost threw it away. She almost threw it away because it came with the ordinary post, sandwiched between a water bill and a catalog she had not asked for, and she was in the middle of something when she brought the letters in from the box, carrying them under her arm while she went back to the kitchen to turn the kettle off. By the time she set the letters down on the table and looked at them properly, the kettle had already boiled and gone cold, which was the kind of small domestic injustice that seemed to happen to Ruth with great regularity. She sorted the letters, bill, catalog, and then the postcard, which she almost put aside without reading, but the handwriting on the address stopped her. She had not seen that handwriting in 31 years. She turned the postcard over. On the front, a photograph of a harbor she recognized, the stone pier, the painted boats, the particular quality of the light in that part of the world in late summer, a blue she had not thought about in a very long time but recognized instantly, the way you recognize a color from a dream. She had been to that harbor. She and Cecily had spent a summer there long before either of them had any idea what their lives would look like when they were both 23 and working at the hotel on the headland and spending every free afternoon on the beach or walking the cliff path or sitting in the harbor cafe drinking tea they could barely afford. She turned the postcard over again. The message was short. It said, "I drove past this place last week and thought of you. I wondered if you were well. I hope you are well." The address was right, which meant Cecily had found it somehow, and the idea of Cecily looking for her address was so strange and so vivid that Ruth sat down at the kitchen table without intending to. There was a return address in the corner, a town in the west. Ruth looked at the postcard for a long time. Then she put the kettle on again. She and Cecily Warbrook had been friends from the age of 19, when they had ended up in adjacent rooms in a shared house and discovered, over the course of a rainy first week, that they could talk to each other in a way that did not require much effort, which both of them had found unusual enough to notice. Ruth had grown up in a family that spoke about practical things, and Cecily had grown up in a family that spoke about very little at all, and they had arrived at the shared house with the same slightly hungry quality, two people looking for a language that fit. They had found it in each other. For 6 years they had been the kind of friends who did not need a reason to telephone, who shared books and opinions and long meandering walks, and the particular shorthand that comes from knowing someone across multiple versions of themselves. They had lived together for 2 of those years in a flat above a bakery that smelled of bread every morning, which Ruth still associated with a specific quality of happiness, warm and yeasty and reliable. Then their lives had moved, as lives do. Cecily had taken a job in another city. Ruth had met the man she would eventually marry. They had written letters for a while, long ones that took real time to compose, and then shorter ones. And then the correspondence had thinned to cards at Christmas, and then to nothing, not through any argument or decision, but simply through the accumulation of distance and time and the daily business of being a person, which takes up more room than you expect. Ruth had thought of Cecily over the years, not constantly, but at specific moments, the way you think of a particular song when the light is a certain color. When she read a book she knew Cecily would have opinions about, When she walked somewhere particularly beautiful and wanted to describe it to someone who would appreciate the description, when she felt the particular loneliness of being in a crowd of people you know reasonably well, but not all the way through. She had never written, she had not known what to say after so many years. There was something in the silence that had made it harder to break the longer it went on, the way ice becomes thicker the colder it gets, until eventually the thought of breaking it feels like more than you can manage. And then a postcard. She picked it up and read it again. I wondered if you were well. I hope you're well. She thought, I am well, not unhappy. My life is a good life. But well is a word with a lot of room in it, and she was not certain she had ever examined the room carefully. She looked at the harbor on the front of the postcard, the blue water and the painted boats and the light. She had not been back to that place in 31 years. She put the postcard against the salt shaker on the table, where it would stay for the next 3 days while she thought about what to do. She was 62 years old. She was recently retired and unaccustomed to having large portions of unscheduled time. She had been filling them adequately, she thought, with the garden and the walking group on Tuesdays, and helping her daughter with the grandchildren on certain afternoons. But adequately was also a word with room in it. On the third day she sat down and wrote a letter. She wrote it the way she had once written letters as a younger woman, properly and at length, not efficiently. She told Cecily that she was well. She told her about the retirement and the grandchildren and the Tuesday walking group. She told her about the garden, which was the thing she spent the most time in, and the thing she found hardest to describe accurately, because what she loved about it was not any specific plant or arrangement, but the quality of attention it required, the way it asked her to slow down and notice things. She wrote that paragraph 3 times before she found the right words. At the end, she wrote, I have been thinking about that summer. Do you remember the afternoon it rained and we took shelter under the fisherman's awning and drank tea for 3 hours and talked about everything? I have thought about that afternoon many times over the years. I never knew why specifically. Perhaps I still don't. But I wanted you to know I have thought about it. She sealed the envelope before she could change anything, and she posted it that afternoon. Then she waited. Act Two: The Harbor Road. Cecily wrote back within a week. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten on cream paper in that familiar script, and Ruth sat at the kitchen table and read it twice without stopping, which was something she had not done with a piece of writing in a very long time. Cecily was well. She had retired 2 years earlier from the school where she had taught literature for 20 years. She lived alone, which she described with the particular clarity of someone who has made peace with a thing and does not need to perform difficulty about it. She had a dog, a large, confused animal she described with great affection. She walked every day along the estuary path near her house, regardless of weather, a habit she had developed in her 50s and now could not imagine living without. She wrote about the postcard. She had been driving through that part of the coast for reasons she described obliquely, a visit to someone who had required the visit, and she had taken the coastal road instead of the faster inland route because she had wanted to see the sea. And when she came around the headland and the harbor came into view, she had thought of Ruth so clearly and so suddenly that it had felt like something she needed to act on. She had bought the postcard at the shop near the pier and written it in the car, slightly awkwardly, and posted it before she could talk herself out of it. She wrote, "I was not sure you would write back. I would not have blamed you if you hadn't, but I am glad you did." Then, on the third page, she wrote, "I have thought about that afternoon too, many times. I have never been entirely sure what made it so vivid. Perhaps it was simply that we were 23 and everything was more vivid then. But I think it was also something else. I think it was one of those afternoons when you are entirely present with another person, when there is no rush and no agenda, and you are simply there together. And that kind of afternoon is rarer than it should be." Ruth read that paragraph several times. She wrote back the next day. They began to correspond regularly, 2 or 3 letters each month, and there was something in the pace of letters, in the delay between sending and receiving, that suited them. It gave each letter a considered quality, a weight that felt right for the distance they were crossing. They were crossing a lot of distance, not geographical, though that too. They were crossing 31 years of separate lives, 31 years of things neither of them had known about the other, and they were doing it slowly, a few pages at a time, which felt appropriate for the scale of what had been missed. Cecily was funny. Ruth had forgotten how funny she was. Not performatively funny, but quietly, observationally funny, the kind of humor that notices the specific absurdity of things and reports it without exaggeration. Ruth found herself laughing aloud at her letters more than once, alone in her kitchen, which was a particular kind of pleasure. And Cecily was, Ruth gradually understood, lonely. Not unhappily so, not in crisis, but she was a person living at a slight distance from the world, and she had learned to be comfortable with that distance. And the comfort was real, but it was also a kind of accommodation, the way you accommodate a room with poor light by learning where to sit. Ruth recognized this. She recognized it because she lived at a slight distance from the world herself, which she had not fully understood until she began to see it in Cecily's letters. The way you sometimes understand your own face better when you see it described by someone who knows you. In November, Cecily wrote, "I find myself wondering if you would want to come back to the harbor. The hotel on the headland is gone, but the town is still there. I drove through it again last week. It looked very much as I remembered it. The painted boats are still painted. I think I would like to go back properly with someone and see what it says to us now." Ruth read this letter at her kitchen table, with the postcard still propped against the salt shaker where she had left it in September, not quite able to put it away. She wrote back, "I would like that. When?" They arranged it for early spring, when the tourist season had not yet begun, and the town would be quiet. It was the longest winter Ruth could remember, and she was not entirely sure why. Her life continued as it had, the garden and the grandchildren and the Tuesday walking group, and she was not unhappy. But she was aware of a quality of anticipation that she had not felt in some time, a sense of something pending, something that had not yet resolved itself into whatever it was going to be. She reread Cecily's letters on certain evenings. She was aware this was a slightly unusual thing to do. She did it anyway. In February she drove to the sea on her own, not to the harbor town, but to a different stretch of coast, just to sit in her car and look at the water, which she could not easily explain to herself, but felt was necessary. She sat there for an hour and a half watching the waves and thinking about Cecily and about that summer and about the conversation under the fisherman's awning, which she remembered more clearly now than she had in years, the tea going cold, the rain on the awning, The way Cecily had said something that Ruth had needed to hear, something she could no longer remember the specific content of, but which had shifted something in her, the way a hand on the shoulder shifts your posture without you noticing. She thought about how many conversations like that she had had in her life. Not many, perhaps a dozen, perhaps fewer. She thought about what it meant to find at 62 a person with whom she might have more of them. Act 3. What the Sea Says. They arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of March. Ruth drove, and Cecily had taken the train to meet her at a station 40 minutes from the coast, and they had recognized each other immediately on the platform, which Ruth had been quietly anxious about. The small fear that 31 years might have made them strangers in a way that photographs and letters could not prepare you for. But Cecily came through the barrier and looked at Ruth and said, without preamble, your hair went curly, and Ruth laughed, because it had, and she had not thought about whether Cecily would notice, and the noticing was so entirely like Cecily that the 31 years felt, briefly, like a very small thing. They were in the car and talking before they had left the station car park. The town was quiet, as they had hoped. The seafront shops were mostly closed, their shutters down, the season not yet arrived. The harbor sat in the March light without drama, the stone pier, the painted boats, the cold blue water. Not the blue of high summer, this was a different blue, cooler and more serious, but the same harbor without question, the same shape of things. They parked and walked. They walked along the pier first, which was empty except for a man at the far end doing something with rope that they could not quite identify. The wind came in from the sea and it was cold, and they both had their coats buttoned and their hands in their pockets, and this felt right somehow, to be slightly cold, to have the weather making a point. Cecily said, I had forgotten how the air smells here. Ruth said, I hadn't, but I had forgotten that I remembered it. They walked the harbor road and the cliff path and the beach, which was also empty except for a dog running in energetic circles in the distance, belonging to someone invisible. They walked for 2 hours and they talked for most of that time, the way they had once talked, without effort, following the thread of things wherever it went. They talked about their lives and their families and the specific textures of getting older, the losses and the adjustments and the things that had surprised them. Cecily talked about the years after her marriage ended, which she had not written about in detail, and Ruth listened carefully. Ruth talked about the years after her husband died, which she also had not written about in detail, and Cecily listened carefully. Careful listening, Ruth thought, was a specific skill. Not everyone had it. Cecily had always had it. They found the Harbor Cafe, which was open because it was the kind of place that stays open year-round for the people who live there rather than the people who visit. They sat in the window and ordered tea, and when the tea came, Ruth looked at it and then looked at Cecily and said, Do you remember? Cecily said, The rain. Yes, I have thought about that afternoon so many times. Ruth said, What did you say to me that afternoon? I have been trying to remember for months. I know you said something. I know it mattered, but I cannot find the exact words. Cecily was quiet for a moment. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked out at the harbor, and Ruth watched her. This person she had known and lost and found again, 63 years old with gray in her hair and the same quality of stillness she had always had. the capacity to be fully in a moment without fidgeting inside it. Cecily said, I don't remember either, specifically, but I remember what we were talking about. You were frightened. This would have been that summer before you met Thomas, before any of the lives we actually lived. You were frightened that your life was about to become something you hadn't chosen, that it was going to happen to you rather than because of you. And I said something about that. I don't know what exactly. Ruth thought about this. She said, I think you said that the life happening to you and the life you choose are not always different things. Cecily looked at her. She said, that does sound like something I would say. Ruth said, it was exactly what I needed to hear. I didn't know it then. I knew it later. The tea cooled in their cups while they talked, the same way it had cooled 31 years ago under the fisherman's awning, and the harbor was quiet outside the window, and a gull landed on the stone wall and considered something and then flew away. Ruth thought, this is one of those afternoons. She thought, I am entirely present with another person, and there is no rush and no agenda, and we are simply here together. She thought, I am 62 years old, and I did not know this was still possible, and I am grateful for the not knowing, because finding it again is a better thing than having expected it. After the cafe, they walked back to the pier as the afternoon darkened toward evening. The cold was sharper now, and the water had gone from blue to gray, and the painted boats moved slowly in the swell, their fenders squeaking against the stone in a soft, irregular rhythm. Cecily said, I am glad I sent the postcard. Ruth said, so am I. I nearly threw it away. It came with the water bill. Cecily laughed. She said, I nearly didn't send it. I sat in the car for 20 minutes. Ruth said, why did you in the end? Cecily was quiet for a moment. She said, because I thought about what I would feel like if I didn't, and I didn't want to feel like that. Ruth understood this. She had made a number of decisions in her life on exactly this basis, and they had generally been the right ones. The decisions you make to avoid the particular feeling of having held back when you didn't need to. They drove back to the station in the early evening, and Ruth waited until Cecily's train was called, which was 40 minutes, and they sat in the small station cafe and drank coffee and talked. When the train was called, Cicely stood and put on her coat, and Ruth stood too, and they looked at each other. Ruth said, we should not leave it another 31 years. Cecily said, no, we should not. They did not hug self-consciously. They hugged the way you hug someone you know, which is different from the way you hug someone you are relearning to know, and the fact of it being the former rather than the latter was something Ruth noticed and was glad of. She drove home in the dark, 2.5 hours, the motorway, and then the smaller roads, and then her own street, and her own driveway, and her own kitchen. She put the kettle on. She sat at the table while it boiled, and she looked at the postcard, which was still propped against the salt shaker where it had been since September. She picked it up and looked at the harbor on the front, the painted boats, the particular blue of the late summer light. She thought about what Cecily had said about sending it, because I thought about what I would feel like if I didn't. She thought about all the things she had not done over the years for reasons that seemed large at the time and now seemed smaller, the letters not written, the visits not made, the conversations not started, the people she had let drift because drifting was easier than pulling against the current. She did not think about this with regret exactly. She had enough life left to be more interested in what came next than in cataloging what had been missed. The kettle boiled. She made her tea and carried it to the table, and she looked at the postcard for a moment longer. Then she set it down, not against the salt shaker this time, but flat on the table, face up, the harbor visible. She thought about calling Cecily when she got home, just to say that the drive had been fine, just to say that the day had been good. She would probably do that. She probably would. And she thought about next time, not the harbor, they had done the harbor. Somewhere new, somewhere neither of them had been, somewhere that belonged to who they were now, rather than who they had been. They would find it. They had time, both of them, more unscheduled time than they had expected at this point in their lives, and the unscheduled quality of it, which had seemed at times like a problem to be solved, now seemed like something else. It seemed like a door left open. She drank her tea slowly and let the evening settle around her, and thought of the water, the long gray swell of it, the painted boats moving in their quiet rhythm, and Cicely beside her on the pier with her coat buttoned and her hands in her pockets, looking at the sea with the same expression she had always had, that quality of serious attention, as if she genuinely expected the sea to say something and was willing to wait until it did. Ruth smiled at that. She thought, I know that person. After everything, I still know that person. And knowing it felt in the quiet of her kitchen with the tea in her hands and the postcard on the table like an extraordinary piece of luck, the kind of luck you do not see coming, the kind that arrives in the ordinary post on a Thursday, between the water bill and the catalog you did not ask for, the kind you nearly throw away. End of novel.